In a small building in rural Virginia, a tape deck hums to life. The reels turn slowly, pulling brown magnetic tape past worn heads. A voice, calm, measured, begins to guide someone through a sequence of breathing patterns and mental exercises. Around the corner, in a Fort Meade office, a different kind of machine is running. A typewriter. An Army officer sits before a blank page. He has been asked to make sense of what happens in those Virginia rooms, to translate the subjective experiences of people in headphones into the language of analysis and assessment. The document he produces will become a focal point for decades of speculation online. But before the internet, it was just paper.
Welcome to Unexplained History. I'm Tom McKenzie. Over the next hour, we're walking through one of the strangest confluences of military curiosity, fringe practice, and public mythology. And it all starts with a memo. It's an Army memo, not a magic manual.
On June 9, 1983, Wayne M. McDonald, a lieutenant colonel in Army intelligence, completed a document titled Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. The memo was addressed to the Army Operational Group stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. The letterhead read U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, INSCOM. What McDonald was analyzing wasn't a weapon system or a foreign threat. It was a training program. A series of audio exercises developed at the Monroe Institute, a research organization founded in 1971 in the foothills of Virginia. The Gateway Experience, as it was called, used specially designed sound patterns, binaural tones, low frequencies, rhythmic pulses to guide people through a progression of mental states. Practitioners would sit in small rooms, don headphones, and follow instructions. Focus level 10. Focus level 12, each level a step deeper into altered consciousness. The Institute had been running these programs quietly for over a decade when the Army's curiosity was triggered. Someone decided that understanding Gateway might be strategically useful. McDonald was tasked with the job.
So what exactly was he looking at?
McDonald's memo attempted to map Gateway language onto scientific frameworks. The Institute claimed that its audio protocols could enable a form of non-local perception, the ability to access information or experience events outside the normal boundaries of time and space. McDonald took those claims seriously enough to document them, but his tone throughout the memo was cautious. He wasn't endorsing extraordinary abilities. He was translating. He was trying to build a bridge between the subjective language of meditation instructors and the objective language of Army assessment. His careful choice of words may enable purports to achieve, created a strange middle ground between bureaucratic skepticism and genuine engagement with unusual ideas. For decades, that memo lived in filing cabinets. A small number of researchers and Gateway practitioners knew of it. Others encountered it through underground photocopies or military archives accessed with difficulty. Then the internet arrived. The memo surfaced online. Suddenly, thousands of people who had never heard of the Monroe Institute or Gateway could read McDonald's words themselves. But context had evaporated. The careful qualifications disappeared. What remained was an official-looking Army document that seemed to validate extraordinary claims. McDonald's methodical attempt to understand an unusual practice became read as proof that the practice worked. That transformation, from administrative curiosity to viral evidence, shaped how millions of people have understood Gateway ever since. A document written by a thoughtful officer trying to make sense of unusual claims became a monument to those claims themselves. The very act of formal documentation had changed the thing being documented.
In the next segment, we're stepping into those Virginia rooms. We'll hear how the training actually works, the audio sequences, the breathing patterns, the sensory design that Gateway built into its protocols. Once you understand the stagecraft, you can begin to understand why an Army officer would struggle to translate it, and why that struggle matters so much today. Why would an Army intelligence officer spend pages translating guided meditation scripts into physics metaphors. We're inside a small training room at the Monroe Institute in rural Virginia. The walls are wood-paneled. Quiet. Your headphones are on. What happens in the next hour? This is the Gateway training system, the actual procedure, the tapes, the step-by-step instructions that became the subject of a classified Army memo. Let's walk through a session.
You settle into a chair. A recorded voice begins. The first instruction is simple. Breathe slowly. In through your nose, hold. Out through your mouth. This is resonant breathing, a rhythm meant to calm your nervous system before anything else begins. The voice reads an affirmation, something like, "I am more than my physical body. As I move through these exercises, I will experience expanded awareness." The words repeat. You hear them. You repeat them mentally. This is not hypnosis, the manual says. You remain awake and in control.
And then the tones begin.
Two frequencies play at slightly different pitches, what the Institute called Hemi-Sync. They pulse beneath the voice, steady and subtle. The Gateway Intermediate Workbook, copyrighted in 1977, outlines the sequence. Each focus level, Focus 10, Focus 12, Focus 15, has its own script and its own tone pair. The workbook calls this Rebal, a set of instructions to help practitioners move through stages of deeper focus. Robert A. Monroe had formalized these practices. He was inventive, experimental. He'd spent years running small sessions in his own home before the Institute existed. What he was building wasn't meant to be extraordinary. It was procedural work, controlled, predictable, designed to guide people toward specific subjective states. You follow the tape, you follow the breathing, you follow the affirmation. Practitioners report drifting toward edges of sleep, feeling shifts in their attention, completing visualizations. Monroe's personal reports from his own practice became the raw material. He documented what he experienced, what patterns he noticed, and he converted those observations into structured training manuals. His work transitioned from private experimentation to an institutional offering. By the mid-1970s, the Institute was running regular programs. Civilians attended. Then, quietly, so did people from intelligence and military agencies. That's where things shift. A training system built around auditory cues, breathing, and visualization becomes the subject of a technical assessment. An Army office commissions an analysis. They want to know, what is this? How does it work? Can we build a scientific model for it?
The memo opens with a mandate. It asks researchers to analyze Gateway and construct a framework. How did a training system designed for subjective focus end up under official review? On June 9, 1983, an Army officer sat down at a typewriter and wrote a memo. Nothing seemed unusual about it at the time. But 20 years later, when that document found its way online, a single rubber stamp would reshape how millions of people understood what it meant. This is the story of how an administrative note became conspiracy fuel and what actually happened in between.
Fort Meade sits in Maryland, humming with the ordinary machinery of military bureaucracy. Grey corridors, fluorescent lights, the soft click of typewriter keys and the thunk of rubber stamps on paper. This was Wayne M. McDonald's world. He was a lieutenant colonel with the Army Operational Group, tasked with a particular job: take experimental training techniques that soldiers were learning and try to fit them into a coherent theoretical framework. The training itself wasn't secret. Soldiers were practicing what they called focus states, guided mental techniques, repetitive scripts designed to alter attention and perception. McDonald's assignment was different. He needed to explain how these practices might work in terms of neuroscience and physics. He was careful. He wrote with measured language. He acknowledged limitations. He used metaphors to bridge the gap between what trainers were teaching and what science might eventually prove. But he also pulled in language about distance, consciousness, and time in ways that made the memo sound more definitive than it was.
And that's where the problem started.
The memo circulated within military channels for decades. It was filed away, forgotten. Then, in 2003, someone declassified it. A date stamp appeared on the document, approved for release September 10, 2003. But here's what happened next. That same stamp carried a CIA identifier. The document didn't originate at the CIA. The CIA simply cleared it for public release. Yet when the memo hit the internet, that small detail got lost. People saw the CIA mark and assumed the agency had authored it, studied it, maybe even validated it. The memo's most speculative passages started circulating in viral clips. Phrases about consciousness and distance, stripped from their careful context, sounded like they were describing literal claims. People online began calling it the CIA Gateway Report, as if the agency had conducted secret research and now endorsed the conclusions. The technical language McDonald had used as metaphor, analogies drawn from physics, got read as proof. His administrative caution, his repeated hedging, his honest note about limitations, all of that evaporated in the retellings. Wayne had written a document trying to bridge training and theory. He became the unwitting anchor of a provenance argument. Was he claiming consciousness could literally step outside time and space? Was the army running a secret program? His own words, excerpted and recontextualized, began to seem like answers to questions he had never asked. The memo's methodology, its honest assessment style, was republished without the steady voice that had shaped it. A single archival stamp had changed not what the document said, but who people believed had said it.
So, when the memo uses physics language, did it mean literal physical claims or metaphorical models? One page says it clicks out of time-space. That line went viral in forums and online communities. What did it actually mean? To understand that phrase, we need to talk about physics and where the memo's language really came from.
The memo sits in the archive. Declassified stamps darken its corners. A physicist reads it now, her voice steady and careful. She points to a single sentence, the one that captured imaginations. The gateway experience, the memo proposes, lets consciousness escape time and space at something called the Planck distance. For those who don't work in physics, this needs translation. The Planck length is approximately 1.616 times 10 to the power of negative 35 meters. That's incomprehensibly small. It's the scale where our everyday physics breaks down and quantum effects take over.
So why invoke something so exotic?
The memo's author was trying to sound rigorous. Planck scale language gave the claim a sheen of legitimacy. But here's the problem. The brain operates at a macroscopic scale. Neural oscillations happen in millimeters and microseconds, nowhere near the subatomic realm. Invoking Planck-scale phenomena to explain how a human mind might slip out of time is what physicists call a category error, like arguing that poetry obeys the laws of thermodynamics. without a testable theory that bridges that vast gap, a mechanism showing how subatomic physics could reshape brain states large enough to alter consciousness, the claim floats untethered from evidence. It borrows the authority of physics without doing the physics work.
Where did these metaphors originate?
Itzhak Bentov was an inventor and speculative thinker working in the 1970s. His notebooks brimmed with resonance analogies, ideas about how consciousness might work like vibrating strings or oscillating systems. His work was creative and exploratory, the kind of thinking that sometimes sparks new directions in science. But Itzhak wrote for a small audience. His metaphors lived in personal writings, in informal circles of seekers and engineers curious about consciousness. Then something shifted. His resonance language spread beyond its original context. Analysts and researchers began citing his ideas, adapting his metaphors to frame military and intelligence assessments about subjective experience and altered states. Itzhak's speculative tools became institutional rhetoric. What had been personal speculation transformed into something that looked like scientific grounding when stamped on a memo and shelved in a classified archive. When technical terms are borrowed without rigor, they can lend false weight to extraordinary claims. The memo didn't invent this problem, it inherited it. The physics sounded precise because the language was borrowed from precise fields. But precision in wording isn't the same as precision in logic.
Where did the memo's physics-sounding metaphors come from, and who wrote them into the cultural vocabulary? The memo we've been examining didn't appear out of nowhere. Behind its language and concepts lay decades of scientific curiosity, speculation, and cross-disciplinary thinking. To understand where the memo's ideas came from, we need to meet the thinkers whose work supplied its vocabulary.
In the 1970s, a certain kind of book lined the shelves of university libraries and independent bookstores. Paperbacks with soft focus covers, titles promising bridges between neuroscience and consciousness itself. These weren't mainstream textbooks. They were speculative, tentative, filled with diagrams and metaphors about how the brain might work. Itzhak Bentov was one of these writers. An inventor and engineer, he spent years thinking about resonance. The idea that systems vibrate at certain frequencies and respond when stimulated at those same frequencies. He wondered if the human brain operated the same way, if sound waves at specific frequencies could influence brain rhythms. His work was exploratory. He wasn't claiming his ideas were proven. He was asking questions. Around the same time, Carl H. Pribram, a neuroscientist, was developing what he called the holonomic brain theory. Carl's hypothesis used imagery from physics, particularly holograms and wave patterns, as a way to imagine how memory and perception might be organized in the nervous system.
These weren't claims about what the brain definitely does, right?
No, Carl explicitly framed his work as exploratory theory, but his writing was compelling. It offered rich metaphors that appealed to researchers and thinkers across disciplines. Over time, those metaphors began to circulate beyond neuroscience. They appeared in discussions about consciousness, perception, even spirituality. The imagery was powerful. Brains as resonant systems, consciousness as wave interference, awareness as something that could be tuned or entrained. By the late 1970s, when the Monroe Institute began working on what would become their Hemi-Sync process, these metaphors were already floating through popular science and fringe academic circles. The Institute held a patent describing Hemi-Sync as a patented auditory guidance system, sounds designed to produce a frequency-following response in the brain and heighten selected awareness or performance. The language borrowed from resonance theory and holonomic imagery.
So the metaphors migrated from theoretical essays into technical patent language.
Exactly. And that's where the problem begins. When an analogy, a way of thinking about something, shifts into the language of an official system or a government assessment, readers can start treating it as mechanism, as proof. The memo itself, when it appeared in Army files years later, used similar language: hemispheric synchronization, frequency following response, heightened awareness, all rooted in those 1970s speculative models. But now they appeared inside a classified military assessment, stripped of their original uncertainty and framed as part of what the technology might reliably produce.
How did 1970s speculative neuroscience and resonance metaphors travel from essays into an Army assessment? For decades, the Gateway memo sat in filing cabinets and restricted terminals. It wasn't secret in the way we usually think. It was just obscure, buried in archives that only specialists could reach. But in 2017, something changed. The CIA's CREST archive went online and became searchable. And suddenly, niche documents that had been gathering dust became discoverable by anyone with an internet connection.
To understand how a memo moves from institutional file to viral interpretation, you have to understand how archives work. A stamp, a declassification notation, a date, a security clearance marking carries enormous weight. It signals authority. It signals that someone official has reviewed this document and decided it was safe to release. But the stamp doesn't explain the document. It doesn't provide context about what worked, what failed, or how tentative the original conclusions actually were. The archivist tasked with cataloging these materials faced a familiar problem. How do you index a memo about a classified research program in language that makes sense to a public searcher? What keywords capture the topic without overstating it? The choices made during this process, the subject headings, the summary lines, the metadata tags, became the lens through which people encountered the document. And those choices, made with care and precision by professionals doing careful work, could shift how the public read the material.
Did the Archives organization contribute to misunderstanding?
Not through intent, but through scale. When the CREST database went live, the volume of newly accessible material was staggering. Researchers, journalists, and curious amateurs could now query the entire collection from home. A document released on September 10, 2003, marked as declassified and available, suddenly appeared in search results, alongside contemporaneous reporting, forum discussions, and YouTube videos. The memo's original language, careful, hedged, full of caveats about methodological limits, began to circulate in spaces where those caveats often got compressed or dropped entirely. The archivist's job became more complicated. They fielded inquiries from people who'd found the memo online and wanted confirmation of what it proved. They answered emails from documentarians, podcasters, and true believers asking why certain passages weren't highlighted or why the archive didn't include supplementary files. The workflow shifted. What had been a quiet practice of organizing documents for academic specialists suddenly required managing public expectations and managing misattribution. The memo itself opened with a mandate. It stated that the task was to assess the Gateway project and construct a scientific model. The author was explicit about what he was attempting: to take anecdotal reports and experimental logs and try to fit them into a framework. But that framing, that interpretive move, often got lost when the document was excerpted or summarized in secondary sources. What remained was the institutional stamp, and the findings, without the context of the author's own acknowledged limitations.
When a declassified document enters the open internet, its meaning becomes harder to contain. The author's caveats and methodological concerns were real and carefully documented. But what does the memo actually report about the experiments themselves, and where did the author himself flag the weaknesses in the evidence? The Gateway tapes sat in relative obscurity for decades. Then, the pandemic changed everything. Suddenly, people searching for meaning and connection discovered these recordings online, and their stories began to spread. But what happened when thousands of newcomers started listening? We talked to people who've guided others through these practices, and they had some sobering reflections about what they were witnessing.
In the years after 2020, the Monroe Institute's audio programs found an unexpected surge in demand. Social media clips, curated playlists, and testimonial videos introduced millions to the decades-old methodology. People shared their experiences with raw honesty, vivid landscapes they'd traveled through, profound insights they'd received, or simply the strange sensation of consciousness shifting in ways they couldn't quite name. A long-time facilitator at the Monroe Institute reflected on this influx. They described the early excitement, the sense that something genuinely valuable was reaching people who needed it. But as more participants arrived, the trainer began noticing something troubling. Some listeners reported feeling destabilized after sessions, sleep paralysis, disorientation, a lingering sense of dread they couldn't explain.
That must have been difficult to witness.
The trainer felt caught between two responsibilities. On one hand, they'd seen genuine transformations, people who came in searching and left with a sense of direction. On the other, they began to suspect that the rapid commercialization and online reach had left newcomers without adequate preparation or support. The trainer made a deliberate shift. They started documenting participant reports more carefully, asking detailed questions about what people experienced and how they felt afterward. They tightened intake procedures, asking about mental health history and whether someone was in a stable place to explore altered consciousness. This caution wasn't dismissal. The trainer remained proud of the work and believed in its potential. But pride and responsibility meant acknowledging that these practices could affect people in unexpected ways. When commercial retreats began offering weekend immersions built around the tapes, attendance surged. Yet the trainer also noticed something. Fewer people returned for follow-up sessions or deepening work. Many had gotten what they came for, a peak experience, a story to tell, and moved on. Some of those participants had also begun exploring a much older claim embedded in Gateway law, that sustained practice with these audio techniques could sharpen one's ability to perceive information at a distance, to gather knowledge about distant places or people through consciousness itself. This idea circulated in online communities, discussed in private forums and shared between enthusiasts. It was the Gateway method's most controversial assertion, yet it was gaining traction precisely because the testimonials felt so personal and so real.
Personal conviction and emotional truth can feel very powerful.
And they do matter. They tell us why these recordings matter to people and what they're hoping to find. Yet there's a gap between a deeply felt subjective experience and something we can measure and replicate in a laboratory. People report vivid journeys, meaningful dreams, and moments of clarity. Those reports deserve respect, but do they constitute evidence that the method works the way its advocates claim? That's where the story gets complicated.
So, how do personal testimonies, powerful and genuine as they are, stack up against what science can actually verify about non-local perception and remote viewing? we've heard extraordinary claims from people who say they've traveled beyond their bodies and gathered information no one else could know. But when researchers and intelligence agencies actually tested those claims, the results told a very different story. So what does the science actually show?
In 1995, the American Institutes for Research conducted a rigorous review of remote viewing claims. Their goal was straightforward: determine whether the phenomenon could produce reliable, actionable intelligence for government use. The evaluation found something important. When researchers used proper controls, double-blind procedures where neither the person nor the evaluator knew what information was being tested, the statistical signals that had seemed promising began to fade or become ambiguous.
What do those controls actually mean in practice?
Think of it this way. If you're testing whether someone can predict coin flips, you don't tell them ahead of time which coin is being flipped. And you also don't let the person scoring the results know until after all the flips are recorded. That removes the possibility of hints, conscious or unconscious, that could inflate the success rate. Researchers also pre-register their methods beforehand, so the rules don't shift based on how the data looks. When these methodical safeguards were applied to remote viewing trials, the results didn't hold up. The AIR evaluation concluded that while some statistical patterns appeared above chance in laboratory settings, the information obtained was not operationally useful. It didn't reliably point to real-world targets or hidden locations. It couldn't be acted upon. Around the same time, neuroscientist Olaf Blanke was approaching this puzzle from a different angle. Rather than asking whether consciousness could leave the body, he asked, what happens in the brain when someone reports feeling separated from their physical location? Blank's work demonstrated that out-of-body experiences could be induced through focal disruption of specific brain regions, particularly areas involved in how we integrate sensory signals and construct our sense of where we are in space. His experimental protocols were reproducible. Other labs could follow the same steps and generate similar results. He had reframed the entire question. This was not meant to dismiss the subjective intensity of what people experienced. The feeling of leaving the body is real, neurologically real. But it pointed toward an explanation rooted in how the brain processes information about self-location and multisensory integration, rather than a consciousness that could non-locally access distant information. That shift had enormous implications for how we understand both the subjective reports and the operational limitations seen in intelligence evaluations.
Agencies looked at the mixed lab results and the lack of actionable outcomes, and they made a choice. If effects don't reliably survive careful measurement and don't produce intelligence you can actually use, why continue the investment? But that raises a deeper question. Given these mixed scientific signals and strong personal accounts, what alternative explanations might account for why so many people report such vivid experiences? Over the past few decades, a classified Army memo became something far bigger than anyone expected. What started as a government document ended up everywhere, on social media, in wellness retreats, in people's homes. Today, we're looking at how that happened and what it means when declassified material enters the market and the internet. How does an old piece of archival evidence turn into myth?
In 2021, something shifted. The gateway experience and the memo behind it weren't new. Researchers had known about them for years. But then, short videos started circulating online. Clips from retreats, audio samples, Testimonies. TikTok creators compressed decades of cautious language into 30 seconds. Influencers shared their own stories. Each video added a new layer: mystery, possibility, transformation. The transformation wasn't just digital. Commercial interest exploded. Retreat centers expanded their programs. Online courses appeared. Merchandise followed. The wellness industry saw opportunity into classified material and moved fast. Access, once limited to archives and researchers, became a consumer product. That speed changed how the memo circulated. It wasn't studied slowly anymore. It was sold, shared, and mythologized in real time.
What does the science actually show?
A systematic review of the research tells a more complicated story than the marketing does. Studies on binaural beats and audio entrainment show mixed results. Some researchers have documented EEG changes, measurable shifts in brainwave patterns. But here's the catch. Those brainwave changes don't reliably produce the same cognitive or paranormal effects across different people. One person might report clarity or altered perception. Another hears nothing unusual. The science doesn't support a guarantee. The memo itself was cautious. It described observations and possibilities, not certainties. But when that language traveled through clips, memes, and marketing copy, nuance got lost. Might became does. Suggests became proves. Rumor filled the gaps. People online began talking about a missing page, a hidden layer of evidence buried in the archives. Journalists investigated. Archivists confirmed there was no missing page. But by then, the story had already spread. That feedback loop, creators generating content, audiences engaging, commercial platforms amplifying reach, rumors emerging to fill uncertainty, transformed an administrative document into a cultural object. The memo wasn't being read anymore. It was being performed. And for some people, the consequences were real. A Monroe Institute participant, recent retreat attendee, found genuine meaning in their experience. The practices offered framework and community at a moment when they needed both. But something shifted during an unsupervised session at home. The intensity of their experience destabilized them. They felt disconnected, anxious, unable to ground themselves. What had felt transformative became frightening. They sought professional support and eventually rebuilt their practice with guidance. Their story sits at the center of uncomfortable questions about responsibility. When commercial operators market intense psychological experiences, what duty do they have to screen participants or prepare them for difficulty?
So, we're left with a fundamental tension. Personal meaning doesn't require scientific proof, but marketing claims do. When declassified material circulates in wellness markets, the standards matter. What practical responsibilities follow from the memo's cultural journey and renewed market interest? We've traveled through declassified files, viral reinterpretations, and the science behind extraordinary claims. Now it's time to step back and ask, what does any of this really mean for how we read archives, how we think about consciousness, and what we should expect from commercial products that promise transformation? Wayne M. McDonald wrote his memo as an army assessment, careful, speculative, grounded in the language of research, but not in rigorous replication. That distinction matters more than most people realize.
When Wayne's memo circulated online, it moved far beyond its original context. What began as an internal reflection on a military-sponsored program became proof in the hands of those who wanted to believe. But the people who read it most carefully, archivists, Journalists, researchers, began to notice something important. The memo wasn't a validation, it was a translation. And translations shift meaning. The neuroscience tells us something clearer now. When researchers stimulate a specific region in the brain called the temporoparietal junction, they can trigger out-of-body experiences. The sense of floating, of separation from your physical form. These aren't proof of consciousness leaving the body. They're windows into how the brain constructs the feeling of location, of being somewhere. Multisensory integration and self-location mechanisms explain what we experience, even when that experience feels transcendent.
And the systematic research on entrainment, the idea that sound patterns can synchronize brain waves into altered states, shows inconsistent results across studies.
Personal reports are powerful. They can move us, inspire us, change how we think about ourselves. But power and accuracy aren't the same thing. A transformative experience doesn't require the mechanism behind it to work as advertised. You can feel profound change without accessing non-local perception. That's not diminishment, that's honesty. Here's what changed after the memo went public. People started asking harder questions about how declassified documents get read and shared. Readers now consult multiple sources before drawing conclusions. Archivists and journalists became more cautious about context, about resisting the temptation to extract a sensational excerpt and call it evidence. That shift protects both research integrity and the people who seek guidance from it. So what should you do when you encounter extraordinary claims about consciousness, technology, or declassified programs? Start with provenance. Where did this document come from? Who wrote it? And what was their actual role? Seek peer-reviewed evidence, not anecdotes, not declassified memos, but systematic studies that have survived scrutiny. Demand pre-registered protocols from researchers, so you know the study wasn't designed after the fact to find what the investigator hoped to find. And when commercial providers make promises, ask them for transparent data, independent replication, and honest acknowledgement of what remains unknown. The memo remains public and consequential, not because it unlocked consciousness, but because it shows us how archives change meaning when context falls away. That's the real mystery here. How interpretation shifts, how institutions communicate what they know and don't know, and why responsible reading matters more than sensational narratives ever will.
If a rigorous, pre-registered study ever produced unambiguous, replicable evidence of non-local perception, how would science and intelligence institutions need to change to accommodate that discovery?